The Night the Guns Went Silent. The Christmas Truce of 1914. Hello, my friend. Thank you for pressing play tonight. Whether you're sitting back on the couch after a long day, or you've already climbed under the blankets and are letting your eyes grow heavy, I appreciate that you're here with me. I know there are a million things you could be doing right now, but instead you chose to listen to a history story. That means a lot. Before we get started, I always like to ask, where are you listening from? I love scrolling through the comments and seeing the variety to places people tune in from. Sometimes it's someone in a small town in the Midwest, another person in London, or maybe even a listener in Australia, wide awake in the middle of their day while the rest of us are winding down. So, if you feel like it, let me know in the comments where you're joining from. It helps me picture this community that's growing, one story at a time. All right, let's settle in. Tonight's story is a war story, but not the kind you might expect. It's not about the clash of armies or the roar of artillery or who claimed victory and who suffered defeat. Tonight's story is about something unusual that happened in the middle of one of the darkest wars in history, a moment when soldiers, tired of killing, decided, just for a brief time, to stop, to sing, to laugh, to share, to be human. This is the story of the Christmas Truce of 1914, a night when the guns fell silent and enemies became friends. The world at war. To understand why this moment was so extraordinary, we have to step back into the world of 1914. World War I had erupted only months earlier, in the summer. Nations across Europe were pulled into it like dominoes, tipping over one after the other. The spark had been the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. But what followed was a tangled mess of alliances, promises, and rivalries that dragged nearly every major European power into conflict. By December of that year, the war was still young. Leaders and politicians had promised it would be quick, that their soldiers would be home by Christmas. But by the time Christmas actually came around, it was clear that wasn't true. Instead of a fast-moving war of bold cavalry charges and glorious victories, the Western Front had bogged down into something far more terrible. Trench warfare. The trenches. Picture this. You're a soldier in December 1914 in northern France or Belgium. The air is wet, the ground is frozen, and you've been ordered to dig yourself into the earth. Mile after mile, the armies on both sides have carved long trenches into the mud, zigzagging ditches reinforced with sandbags and wood, meant to give some protection from machine gun fire and artillery shells. Between you and the enemy is a stretch of land called No Man's Land. It's a wasteland of barbed wire, shell craters, and corpses. If you try to cross it, you'll almost certainly be cut down. Life in the trenches is miserable. You're wet all the time because the ditches flood. You share your space with rats the size of cats, and with lice that crawl through your clothes. Food is scarce and often stale. Sleep comes in fits, stolen between guard shifts and bombardments. The smell of mud, of unwashed bodies, of rotting flesh never really leaves your nose. And then there's the noise, the constant pounding of artillery in the distance, the rattle of machine guns, the occasional scream carried on the wind. It's a world built for exhaustion and despair. The soldiers' minds. By late December, the war has already chewed up thousands of lives. Young men from Britain, Germany, France, Belgium, they'd signed up full of patriotic fervor, thinking they were about to take part in something noble. But after months of sitting in cold mud, watching friends die for a few yards of useless ground, that enthusiasm has drained away. What you miss most isn't glory. It's normal life. A warm fire. The sound of your mother's cooking in the kitchen. The weight of your father's hand on your shoulder. A sweetheart's letter tucked safely into your breast pocket. And with Christmas approaching, those longings only grow sharper. You imagine your family gathered around a tree, sharing food, laughter, gifts. The thought that you're out here in a freezing trench while your loved ones are safe at home is almost too much to bear. The holiday spirit creeps in, but even in war, traditions find their way through. Soldiers on both sides try to make Christmas feel like Christmas, even in the mud. The Germans especially, with their tradition of Christmas trees, start decorating their trenches. They place candles on little fir trees or prop lanterns along the walls. The British and French do the same in their own ways, humming carols, passing around whatever scraps of chocolate, biscuits, or tobacco they've managed to save. And then something unexpected begins to happen. Across no man's land, the British hear singing. Faint at first, carried by the cold air. A melody they don't recognize, but they know it's a Christmas hymn. The Germans are singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night. The British soldiers pause. They listen. Then, almost without thinking, some of them begin to sing too, their version in English. The two songs drift toward each other across the killing fields, meeting in the middle, the calm before the truce. Imagine that moment. For weeks, months even, the only sounds across that space have been gunfire, explosions, and cries of pain. Suddenly, there's music. Familiar, peaceful, almost holy. Some men peek cautiously over the top of the trenches. They see flickers of light, candles, glowing faintly in the German lines. And instead of shots ringing out, they hear voices wishing them well. Merry Christmas. Happy Christmas, Tommy. The British call back. Merry Christmas, Fritz. And in that fragile, surreal moment, the seeds of something unthinkable begin to take root. Life in the trenches before the truce. If you've ever heard people talk about trench warfare, you've probably imagined it as brutal, muddy, and unforgiving. And that's exactly what it was. By the time December of 1914 arrived, the Western Front had already stretched into hundreds of miles of trenches, running from the North Sea in Belgium all the way down through France. Soldiers on both sides were stuck in ditches barely wide enough for two men to pass, surrounded by barbed wire and death. For many of the men, this was their first real winter away from home. They weren't seasoned veterans hardened by years of battle. They were ordinary young men, some barely out of school. They had signed up thinking war would be fast, even romantic. What they got instead was endless waiting, bitter cold, and the creeping dread that this wasn't going to end anytime soon. The everyday struggles. Everyday life in the trenches was its own battle. Food was often a kind of hard biscuit called hardtack, tins of meat that had been sitting on shelves for years, or watery soup. When they were lucky, soldiers received parcels from home, sweets, cigarettes, or socks. A fresh pair of socks was worth more than gold because wet feet in the trenches often led to trench foot, a painful condition where the skin would rot from constant exposure to water and cold. Then there were the rats, big, bold, unafraid of humans. They fed on the dead, lying in no man's land, and grew fat. Soldiers told stories of rats climbing over their bodies as they tried to sleep, nibbling on whatever scraps they had in their pockets. Disease spread quickly. Lice caused constant itching, and respiratory infections thrived in the damp air. If a man wasn't killed by bullets or shells, the mud itself seemed to conspire against him. The mental weight, but the physical hardships were only part of it. The mental toll was heavier. Imagine hearing artillery shells screaming overhead, never knowing if the next one would land directly on top of you. Imagine being woken in the middle of the night by a sudden whistle, scrambling to the firing line, rifle in hand, only to discover it was a false alarm. That constant state of tension wore men down. Sleep was shallow and broken. Letters from home were both a comfort and a curse. Comfort because they reminded you that you were still loved, but a curse because they reminded you of everything you were missing. The holidays made that ache even sharper. A soldier might read about his family sitting around a Christmas tree, or about the roast goose being cooked in his mother's oven, and he would look up from that letter to see mud walls, rats, and a sky full of smoke. Signs of the holiday. As Christmas drew closer, soldiers did what they could to hold on to a sense of normalcy. The British received small Christmas tins sent from Princess Mary, the daughter of King George V. These tins contained things like tobacco, chocolates, or pencils, along with a card wishing them a safe return. It wasn't much, but it was something. The Germans, too, received gifts from home: candles, small fir trees, and food. On Christmas Eve, German soldiers began placing little trees along the edges of their trenches. Lit with candles, they glowed faintly in the dark. British soldiers on the other side could see them flickering, small dots of light along the horizon. At first, they thought it was a trick, maybe even bait, to lure them into firing. But then the sound carried across the frozen air, singing. The Germans were singing Christmas carols. Carols across the battlefield. It began quietly. A single voice at first, then others joining in until it became a chorus. The song was Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, what we know as Silent Night. Its simple melody floated above the mud and barbed wire. British soldiers, stunned, listened from their side. Some recognized the tune and, almost without thinking, began to sing their version in English. Their voices, rough from cold air and smoke, joined in. Silent night, holy night. 2 languages, 2 armies, 2 enemies. But for that moment, the song was the same. First contact. That night, in scattered sections of the Western Front, soldiers began calling out to each other. The Germans shouted, "Merry Christmas, Tommy." The British replied, "Merry Christmas, Fritz." It was strange, surreal. These were the same men who, only hours earlier, had been trying to kill each other. But now, in the glow of lanterns and candles, they were exchanging greetings. In some places, soldiers cautiously lifted their heads above the trenches. In others, they even climbed onto the parapets, standing in full view of the enemy. Normally, that would have been suicide. But on this night, no shots were fired. What began with a song had opened the door to something even more incredible. The men, tired of war, hungry for peace, began to imagine the impossible, walking into no man's land not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. And that's where we'll leave Section 2. In the next part, we'll step directly into the moment the truce truly began, when men climbed out of the trenches, hands raised, and met in the frozen middle ground. Gifts were exchanged, photos shown, and the battlefield transformed into something no one would ever forget. The truce begins. By Christmas morning, the front lines of the Western Front looked different than they had any other day of the war. There was still mud. There was still barbed wire. The dead still lay scattered across no man's land, frozen in the cold December air. But something had shifted. The night before, carols had been sung across the trenches, greetings exchanged. Now the question lingered. Would it go further? First steps into no man's land. In some sectors, it happened slowly. A German soldier climbed out of his trench, holding nothing but a lantern and waving his arms. The British aimed their rifles. tense, unsure if it was a trick. But then the German called out, "Don't shoot. Merry Christmas." A British soldier, shaking his head in disbelief, climbed out too. He carried nothing but a small tin of tobacco. They walked toward each other across the deadly strip of ground that just hours earlier had been swept with gunfire. The two men met in the middle, hesitated, then shook hands. That one handshake opened the floodgates. The flood of humanity. All along the lines, more soldiers began to climb out. Some carried little gifts, a cigar, a bit of chocolate, a tin of jam. Others brought photographs of wives, children, parents, eager to show that they were ordinary men with families just like the enemy. The frozen mud of no man's land, usually a graveyard, now became a meeting place. Men laughed nervously, stumbled over each other's languages, and used gestures when words failed. "Merry Christmas" echoed again and again, as if saying it could somehow erase the horrors of the past few months. The exchange of gifts. What did these soldiers give each other? Not much in material value, but the meaning was priceless. British soldiers offered tins of bully beef, cigarettes, or buttons from their uniforms. Germans handed over cigars, sausages, and beer. Some even traded helmets or insignia as souvenirs. Imagine it. Two men who, by all logic, should be trying to kill each other, instead standing there, laughing, sharing a smoke. In that moment, the war seemed to vanish. Shared humanity. One British private later wrote that he was struck by how young the Germans were. "They looked no older than schoolboys," he said. "It was hard to believe we had been shooting at them." A German soldier, in turn, noted how kind the British seemed, and how absurd it felt to be enemies with men who were so polite. Photos were exchanged. One man showed off a picture of his newborn daughter. Another pulled out a worn photo of his wife in a long dress, smiling shyly at the camera. Their enemies smiled, nodded, and shared their own. It was proof that behind the uniforms and rifles, they were just men with lives waiting back home. The commander's worry. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Officers on both sides worried the truce would weaken discipline. A soldier who had just shaken hands with the enemy might hesitate to fire the next day, but the men didn't care. Orders seemed small compared to the rare gift of peace. In some areas, officers reluctantly allowed it to continue, seeing it was impossible to stop once it began. In others, they tried to shut it down, but the soldiers ignored them, slipping into no man's land anyway. The dead are buried. The truce also gave men the chance to do something they'd been unable to do for weeks. Bury the dead. Between the trenches, bodies had lain where they'd fallen, unreachable under constant fire. Now Germans and Allies worked together side by side, digging graves. Priests and chaplains held joint services, reading prayers in both languages. It was sobering. They laid men to rest who, only days earlier, had been friends and comrades. The shared act of burying the dead bound the soldiers even closer together. A different kind of battlefield. Imagine standing there as a soldier that day. You've lived in fear for months, never knowing if you'd survive to see the next morning. Now you're shaking hands with the man you've been told is your enemy. You're laughing with him, trading gifts, maybe even trying to pronounce his name. For the first time since you arrived, you feel like yourself again. Not just a number in a uniform, not just a weapon in the mud, but a human being. And though you know it can't last, that orders will eventually come, that the war is far from over, you savor every moment. Because for one single day, the war has paused. A day without war. When the sun rose on Christmas Day, 1914, the Western Front did not look like a battlefield. Yes, the trenches were still there, The barbed wire still coiled across no man's land. The ground was still torn by craters and littered with shattered equipment. But for a brief stretch of time, the land between Britain and Germany belonged not to war, but to peace. The men who had spent months ducking gunfire now stood in the open, smiling, shaking hands, laughing, and speaking in broken phrases across languages. What had begun with a single handshake on Christmas Eve had now spread along miles of the front. And what happened next has lived in memory for more than a century. The football matches. You've probably heard the stories of football, soccer, being played during the Christmas Truce, and yes, they really happened. In some sectors, soldiers used whatever they could find for a ball, a tin can, a sandbag stuffed with straw. In a few lucky places, an actual football was pulled out of the trenches. Men marked the goals with their caps, their rifles stuck in the ground, or even just imaginary lines in the mud. British and German soldiers formed teams, their uniforms clashing in the frost as they kicked and stumbled and laughed like boys again. Some accounts say the Germans were better players, more disciplined, while the British prided themselves on scrappy determination. Nobody really kept score. Winning didn't matter. The point was that for a few hours, men who had been enemies the day before were now teammates, shouting and cheering in the cold winter air. Imagine that sight, rifles leaning against the trench walls, the ground that had swallowed so many lives turned into a field of play. For a war that seemed endless, that day felt like stepping into another world. Food and drink shared. There was also food, real food. German soldiers passed out sausages and beer from their rations. British soldiers offered plum pudding, biscuits, and tinned beef. They swapped stories, toasted each other with whatever they had to drink, and for the first time in months, enjoyed a meal without fear of shells crashing overhead. One British soldier later wrote that he drank German beer and ate German sausages, and they were the best he ever had, not because of the taste, but because of the circumstances. Every bite felt like defiance against the war itself. Songs and carols. The singing that had started the night before continued into the day. Men stood together, harmonizing across languages. O Tannenbaum in German, God rest ye merry, gentlemen in English. The melodies carried far down the trenches, so much so that soldiers who weren't even part of the truce could hear the music and wondered what was happening. Some sang loudly, joyfully. Others sang softly, their voices breaking with emotion. It was as if the carols themselves were a prayer, that peace might last longer than just a single day. Photos and souvenirs. Soldiers exchanged small souvenirs as proof of the day. Buttons, badges, belt buckles, helmets. A man might tuck a German button into his pocket and keep it for years, long after the war ended, as a reminder of when the enemy became a friend. They also showed each other photographs. One German soldier proudly displayed a photo of his young wife, wrapped in a heavy winter coat. A British soldier shared an image of his children sitting on a front porch back home. Those photos became a bridge, proof that they were all men with lives, loves, and families waiting for them, no matter which side they wore the uniform of. Religious services. In several places, chaplains and priests led joint services. Men gathered in circles, some kneeling, some standing, as prayers were spoken in both English and German. Hymns rose up, not in one language or the other, but in both together. They prayed for peace, for safety, for their families. They prayed for an end to the war. In one recorded instance, a German priest led the service while a British chaplain translated his words. They stood side by side, two men of faith, guiding enemies through a prayer of unity, the feeling of freedom. More than anything, the truce gave soldiers something they hadn't felt since arriving at the front. Freedom. Freedom to stand in the open without fear of being shot. Freedom to laugh, to smile, to be human again. One soldier later described it as walking out of a nightmare. Another said it was the only day of the war where he truly felt alive. For a brief time, the lines dividing them disappeared, and they could pretend the war didn't exist. The shadow of tomorrow. And yet, beneath the joy, there was a shadow. Deep down, every man knew it couldn't last. The war machine was too big, too powerful, too determined to let peace take hold. Orders would come down soon enough to pick up rifles again. And when that happened, they would have to go back to being enemies. Some soldiers tried not to think about it. Others couldn't stop. They looked at the man across from them, shaking his hand, and wondered, "Tomorrow will I be ordered to kill you, and will you be ordered to kill me?" It was a sobering thought, but still they chose to live fully in that day. They chose joy, if only for a moment. Christmas Day on the front lines ended with laughter, singing, food, and the strangest peace the world had ever seen. But as the sun dipped and the cold night fell once more, the truce began to fade. Orders were waiting, guns were loaded again, and the war that had paused for one day was about to resume. The return of the guns and the memory that lived on as the evening of Christmas Day faded into night. The laughter and warmth of the truce began to cool with the winter air. Soldiers drifted back to their trenches, the flickering candlelight giving way to the familiar darkness of war. Everyone knew the moment couldn't last. Still, many clung to the fragile hope that peace might stretch beyond a single day. By the morning of December 26th, that hope was tested. Orders from above, commanders on both sides had received reports of the fraternization. To them, it was dangerous. A soldier who had shaken hands with the enemy might hesitate to pull the trigger when ordered. Discipline, they feared, was unraveling. Messages were sent down the lines. The truce was over. The war must continue. Some officers barked the orders, determined to reassert control. Others, quietly moved by what they'd seen, gave their men one last day before insisting the rifles be raised again. Either way, the command was clear. The war machine had to resume. The pain of parting. For the men, saying goodbye was not easy. Many had shared food, drinks, songs, and even football matches. They had seen each other not as faceless enemies, but as human beings. Now they faced the unbearable thought that tomorrow they might have to shoot at those same men. In some sectors, soldiers shook hands one last time in no man's land, wished each other luck, and slipped back into their own lines with heavy hearts. A few even promised, half seriously, not to aim too carefully if they found themselves firing at each other. One British soldier wrote later, "We parted as friends, but tomorrow we knew we would be enemies once more." The first shots. On December 26th, rifles cracked again, artillery rumbled back to life. The Christmas truce was over. In some places, men deliberately aimed high for a while, unwilling to break the bond they had formed. But soon the machinery of war took over, drowning out the fragile memory of peace with the thunder of gunfire. Within days, the Western Front returned to the same brutal stalemate it had known before Christmas Eve. The dead once again piled up in no man's land. The cries of men replaced the carols of the night, the legacy of the truce. And yet, what happened on that Christmas in 1914 could never be erased. For the men who lived it, the memory of that day burned brighter than the fire of battle. In letters home, soldiers described it to their families, almost as if they needed to share proof that such a miracle had truly occurred. The stories spread across newspapers, reaching civilians who were stunned to imagine their sons, brothers, and husbands shaking hands with the enemy. Some governments downplayed it, worried it might dampen support for the war. But the story was too powerful to be silenced. In the decades since, the Christmas Truce has become a symbol of humanity's longing for peace, even in the darkest of times. It's taught in classrooms, sung about in songs, reenacted in plays and films. It remains one of the most extraordinary moments in modern history, proof that even in war, compassion can break through. Why it mattered. The Christmas Truce did not end World War I. The war dragged on for 4 more years, consuming millions of lives. In the grand scale of history, the truce was a small moment, barely a flicker against the inferno. But to the men who lived it, and to us who remember it, it mattered. It mattered because it showed that ordinary men with no power to start or stop wars, could still choose peace, if only for a day. It mattered because it reminded the world that humanity can survive even in the mud of the trenches. And it mattered because it proved that sometimes the most powerful stories of war aren't about battles won or lost, but about moments of grace in the midst of destruction. Closing thoughts to you. And now as you sit here listening, maybe at home, maybe in bed with your eyes starting to close, I want to thank you again for being here. These stories mean more when they're shared, and I'm grateful you chose to share this one with me tonight. The Christmas Truce of 1914 is a reminder that even in the harshest places, kindness can bloom. That even when the world seems divided, there are moments when humanity finds its voice. If you're still awake, I'd love to hear from you, where you're listening from, what you felt hearing this story, and maybe which part struck you the most. And if you're already drifting into sleep, that's fine too. Let the story carry you into your dreams. Because history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about people. And tonight we remembered a night when people chose peace. So good night, wherever you are. Sleep well, and thank you for listening.